Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of the New Stack, and you're listening to the New Stack Analyst podcast, a show about application, development, and management at scale. Thanks for joining us. Join us in Toronto at Cloud Native Day for the Great Galaxy Interplanetary Pancake Breakfast with a pancake robot sponsored by Cisco. We're going to be talking about open source ecosystems, just as we are in this podcast sponsored by Cisco. In this episode of the New Stack Analysts, we look at open source ecosystems and how they relate to galaxies and what's happening inside open source ecosystems as we move to scaled out software. Software is at the center of business, and increasingly, software is open source. So check out this podcast with Cisco, our great sponsor, and learn more about Pancake Breakfast at Cloud Native Day in Toronto at thenewstack.io. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here for the New Stack Analysts, here for a show that I've been looking forward to doing for a few weeks now. And it really is related to the evolution of open source communities. And I'll get more into what we're going to talk about. But first, I'd like to introduce who is joining us. We have Ken Owens of Cisco. Hey, Ken.
Hey, Alex.
Hey. And Nadia Eghbal. And Nadia has just joined GitHub. And Nadia has done a lot of work in researching open source communities. And particular, I know you just completed some work with the Ford Foundation.
Yep, that's right.
Great. So here's a topic that we're looking to discuss, and this is really for a preview of a longer discussion we're going to have at ContainerCon Cloud Native Day in Toronto, August 22nd through 25th. And we're going to be doing a breakfast there on this topic with Cisco as a sponsor. So Ken, thank you very much for that.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it'll be fun. We have a name for this at the New Stack. We call this the Galaxy Project. And we call it that because we kind of think of open source communities as somewhat like galaxies. And what's interesting for me right now, and what I'd really like to talk about is how really software is at the center of business, and software is increasingly open source. And so software, in our view, really has to scale. The business has to drive innovation through software. And what we just see over and over and over again is how innovation does require open source software and participation in open source communities. And so, with that in mind, that leads to some questions. My question is, why do so few customers actually participate in open source communities? Now, they're not making the software, right? But they're part of the process because the software itself now, if it is open source, there's whole different types of support models involved. And I'm also then interested in, looking at what are the different hierarchies in open source ecosystems. And we see how open source ecosystems have evolved over the past, 20 years or so. There's different hierarchies and different ways that they're organized. But the question is, are these hierarchies suitable for today's market? Further, how do these communities scale? So really, that's what I'd like to talk about, the centering on the scale out of open source software and these different ecosystems, addressing, these and other questions. And so, with that in mind, Ken, what is your general perspective right now about open source communities and the changing landscape as software becomes the center of every business and open source becomes increasingly open source?
I think, my general perspective in looking at this space for quite some time now is that kind of on the galaxy theme, right? If you are just working in one galaxy, right, or one set of projects that are coordinated together, it all works decently together. There are a few gaps I'll come back to in a minute, but I think the biggest issue we see with our customers is just a lot of complexity in trying to build a solution out of different parts that come from different galaxies, right? It's a complicated set of integration efforts that's needed to pull it all together. And then in the end, you don't really have any one person you can go to for help, right? Or any one source of truth in that economy, right? You sort of have projects you can go and talk to, and if the issue is within the project, they may be of interest in helping to resolve that through their issues process. But if the issue is in the integration, or you expected project A to work better with project B, trying to get someone in project A and project B to support your effort to make them work better together is not an easy thing to do. We only have like a chairman of the galaxies, right? You kind of have all these separate autonomous projects off doing their own efforts, and they have a great job of community development, but they do a poor job of cross-community integration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just sort of adding to that, there's so many different interests at stake with any one open source project, much less like multiple open source projects. And there's sort of this inherent tension between, what did the person who originally authored it want? What does the kind of growing community want? And, that community and their needs could have changed a lot over the years. And then if you have, as companies are trying to participate and give back or contribute to those projects, they might have things that they personally need that nobody else needs. And so if there isn't really an awareness of like what everybody needs, which is sometimes impossible with really big projects, there's just a lot of conflict because, and people might end up perceiving that, you're only doing this because you need it for yourself and it's not helping anyone else, even when someone is, genuinely trying to make things work better together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what was your research at the Ford Foundation?
It was sort of this broader look at what is not being supported in software today. Just sort of thinking about how, I guess more broadly speaking, as all of society is moving towards the digital and, the idea of like tech and software is not just in a single industry, but being used across lots of different industries. Where is all that being built and how is it being supported? And so I tried to look kind of like below the layer of, what the consumer sees about software when they open an app or, they go to a website, and saying like, what is all the underlying infrastructure under that and where does it come from? And trying to make the case that a lot of infrastructure is shared, aka open source. So you have like one project that's being used in multiple pieces of software that the consumer might see. And then saying, well, if we're having all these shared resources, who's actually supporting them? Who's responsible for supporting them? And how do those projects grow and find the support that they need to become really popular? And just started trying to make the case that it's not really that well understood yet. The shift from companies to kind of like more unilaterally using open source software in their own products is actually like a lot newer than some people realize. And so with all this increased demand and with all these companies and people that are just coming to rely on this underlying infrastructure, whose job is it to support it, and how do we get that all together?
Yeah, that gets to the crux of it, doesn't it, Ken?
Yeah, it does, definitely. And just to add to that, right, I see a lot of issues, especially with like the legal groups within some of our larger customers, because it is so new. They don't really, there is law, so I don't want to say there is no precedence, but it's difficult to find precedence in a lot of these different industries because the lawyers are very specifically looking at something that applies to their industry and to what they're trying to accomplish. And it's much broader law for open source than it is specific to an industry or a group of specific workings within the industry, right? And so we see a lot of struggling within the enterprise space, which is getting the company to approve or accept open source components and them, their employees contributing and working with open source back into the community has always been a challenge that we're seeing even more so today than ever before.
I talked to someone who was like basically saying that like some developers know more about licenses than lawyers do, just because like a lot of so much is changing.
It seems to be true today. They have to become almost lawyers to write code for open source, right?
Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely like a lack of just sort of like professional understanding.
And there are so many different ways to license the software. With that in mind, now you're talking about, this shared infrastructure, these shared resources. and who supports them and how well and how it's not understood. What is not understood the most? What are some of the, the themes you see and what's really not understood?
I think it's just sort of this broader assumption from companies that build their own software that somebody out there is making it happen. And sometimes there isn't an understanding if, a company is relying on an open source project and they ask for some sort of like updates or changes, and they don't always know that like maybe the project is being maintained in someone's volunteer time. Maybe nobody is maintaining the project at all. And I think there's just like not enough people talking to each other, and there isn't enough exposure of the human side behind these projects for people to just understand that, it might be a paid job for a software engineer at a company, but it might not be a paid job for an open source developer. And sometimes it is. So like every project is just really different. So I think there's just sort of not enough conversation about like, who are the institutions that actually support open source projects, or like where do they find, it seems like a lot of them just kind of get lucky.
So is that an end customer issue mostly then? And does that correlate to why, we don't see as many, end customers involved in open source projects?
I think that could be part of it. I think there's like sometimes, they might get a reaction of like, well, why doesn't this project want to accept my contribution, or how do we get a contribution in? And from that maintainer's perspective, they might be thinking of it as, especially for, a smaller scope project, that might be, well, this is my project. I don't know why you're trying to, add something into it. There's also a lot of bias against companies being involved.
Oh, there is?
Just for projects that are like very community oriented. I actually talked to a company who said that they had to effectively launder their patches through another consulting firm. So
really?
Perceived as coming from that company, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think on both sides, there's a little bit of like wariness and tension, and maybe from the company, it's sort of like, well, how can I trust this random person who now has control over something that's in my software?
Ken, is that your experience too? Are there other reasons that you're seeing why we don't see, more contributions? Is it that's an interesting kind of factors, is the insulation of the community itself.
Yeah, no, I definitely can echo that. I've seen the exact same thing that Nadia is mentioning. In addition, I'm kind of seeing, I kind of call it the happy path, and what I call it the happy path is when you think about open source communities, in addition to what we've talked about, they don't really think about there being a problem, right? Everything is just going to always work. This project or this software would just install and it would just run forever, and you're never going to have to upgrade it. And if you do have to upgrade it, you can just shut down everything you have and just restart from scratch with the new code, right? Mm-hmm. They don't really seem to go about this with what I like to call sort of the enterprise grade of service assurance and availability, right? So you have things like fault management that are kind of ignored completely in pretty much every project, unless it's a monitoring project, right? You have things like, performance management that, you don't really run into problems. And a lot of the testing that I've been doing over the last several years, most of the problems we run into with open source happen at scale. And these projects don't have the ability to deploy this across 100,000 servers, right? They're working on their laptop mostly. So trying to figure out how this is going to perform at scale it's not even on their radar in most cases, right? And I'm sure that there's some examples you could pull out that that's not the case, but in general, most of the open source projects I've worked with, they always assume that they're kind of on the happy path and nothing bad will ever happen.
The happy path. Do you see the happy path, Nadia?
Yeah. That's a good point. I feel like this funny thing of like with digital infrastructure as well, where it's not like if you build a bridge and the bridge lasts like 200 years or whatever, but with software, it's like, I don't really like this, so I'm just going to, fork it and do something else with it. Or I'm just going to tinker around this project and kind of release it. And it's so easy to just start something new or change something and kind of, use it for your own purposes, that it's also kind of dangerous when you think about like long-term support and for like use cases that aren't just purely like hobbies. Right? I think that's, again, that tension of just like different needs where someone might have just made it because like, why not? And a company might be using it and being like, oh no, we need to like make sure this is actually supported. And sometimes that might be great for the author or the maintainer saying like, oh, good, now I have support. And sometimes it might be like, you know what, I don't really want to deal with your stuff. Like I made it for me.
Yeah, I'm on to new things, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's always the new things that people are interested in many ways. I mean, that's just a human tendency, isn't it?
Yeah. It's really hard. I mean,
not just that, like Alex and Nadia, but I think the other thing is when I look at just my own experience, right? When I'm doing a project, like you can even take this out of the software realm and look at just doing home projects, right? If I just go and focus on one specific aspect of something I want to do in my house, and I don't think about the impact of the other parts of my house and the traffic flow through the house and how other people are going to use what I'm putting together, right? If I just worry about, I want to do it this way because this is what makes sense to me. We're doing I'm doing a kitchen project, and I started kind of working on it myself. It was just going to be to replace the sink. And now all of a sudden my wife wants an entire new kitchen. And so if I just replaced the sink, I would have spent a ton of money on making the sink look nice. But then my wife would have ripped it all out and said, let's put a whole new kitchen in. And I think in a sense, that's kind of what we see in these open source communities, is that to the point Nadia's made really well and succinctly, right? They're so focused on what one problem they want to solve in the way that makes sense to them. They don't really step back and think about this in terms of working with a system of other components that need to also work together in harmony, right? It's really more about, this is a specific use case of what I'm trying to do. This is the community I'm building around this specific use case. If your use case doesn't fit this, then go find another project, right? It's not looking at how do we make these projects work better together. It's all about making my project better.
And I think sometimes like structurally an issue when you just don't have the resources to think about multiple pieces, right? Like if someone has like a couple hours a week to devote to it, or they're doing it on, at night or something, or they treat it as a hobby, then it's, they don't have time to sit down. It's not a company where they have this like, big roadmap and they can serve all the different users and whatever. Sometimes they do. Sometimes projects do have that kind of support, but a lot of times they don't.
Yeah, it's not. It's almost like open source communities haven't been turned into professional entities in themselves where there's different responsibilities. We now have GitHub, where you're going, which is a new way for people to collaborate on projects, but still that basically moved the conversation out of IRC into these public repositories and, in other places. And there's still not that professional development that we're seeing in organizations. So what about the role of foundations then, kind of in that respect? Are they helping build out these open source communities so they do actually have more professional development around them?
Yeah, I mean, for like bigger projects, right? I think foundations have definitely played a really important role. I mean, Linux has definitely done that. Node.js has done that. Python does that. For like the really big projects in that ecosystem. I think the hard part is now there's just like so much fragmentation of projects. Like there's so many tiny things you could be throwing into your software that like it's not really feasible to think about all of them getting supported by a foundation. I think it does work for much larger scope projects or things where it's a little bit more like an ecosystem.
Right.
It's just like a random library that someone has thrown up over the weekend, then it's really different.
Right. The questions that I have then, and I think maybe this relates to the foundations, is these questions about hierarchies, right? Open source communities have developed, the term the benevolent dictator, which I've always found is quite a funny term because dictators are not known as the most gentle of people, nor are their regimes. The benevolent ones are still pretty brutal, and there is that kind of sense to open source communities. I actually just ran across an article today about open source communities and how brutal they can be. Are these hierarchies suitable for today's complexities in terms of their fragmentation and the scale out of the software itself, or are they right and just need some adaptation?
I think so. I just dived into this recently, actually, because I was kind of curious for the answer myself. And saw just sort of like, I guess they're like different historical eras of like types of hierarchies and how they've become popular over time. And so like there was the meritocracy that was really popularized by the Apache Foundation, where they were trying to basically resolve the whole BDFL issue and saying, all right, like instead of this one person declaring themselves benevolent dictator for life, can we create a path for people to be able to participate? And so the idea being that like if you've been in the project for a while, or you've quote unquote shown merit in some shape or form, you end up getting a binding vote on major project decisions. And so they really popularized that model. And I think part of that was so that companies would be able to participate in these projects. Even though, I mean, they formally say that, you have to represent yourself as an individual and you don't represent yourself as a company. But it just gave a path for like other people who are using the projects to be able to influence it beyond just that author or whoever the BDFL is. And right now I'm very curious to see the transition towards like more liberal contribution models, which I think is kind of like the next evolution beyond meritocracies, which Node.js has popularized. And the idea just being to like, instead of trying to create some sort of bottleneck, which I think even a meritocracy does, and saying like, some people are qualified to have a vote, some people are qualified to have a say, other people aren't. Liberal contribution is trying to like respond to, I think, that like wide influx of casual contributions, the just like all the extra noise that you're getting now with like just lots of fragmentation, and trying to say, all right, like we'll empower you as much as possible. Any contribution is great. Like we just want to get you in the funnel, and trying to like basically instead of saying like let's create this bottleneck, let's open it up to as many contributions as possible. And the idea being that all those people will eventually self-organize, they'll be teaching each other. Instead of looking to, say, the BDFL, they're looking to other people in the community for mentorship and support. I think the way they do working groups is like people can sort of like organize their own working group, and it's just like a lot more self-organizing. So I think that is a response to just like increased volume, is to basically like try to flatten the hierarchy and try to let more people in. But it's still really chaotic. And I think on the other end of it, you have like really, really small projects. I mean, if you're talking about just like maintaining a really small scope library and you're not talking about a big complex ecosystem like Node, I think those are still going to be essentially BDFLs, because like, you have like one maintainer, there isn't a lot of room for tons of contributions to grow a huge community around. And I think those are actually the ones I'm more worried about, because it's like, I don't know, what do you do in that situation? How do you grow contributions to,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think, the role of some of the foundations, and as we move to this role contribution model, I do think that's going to help quite a bit, Alex. There's sort of three things that we've been kind of like pushing into the foundation model for measuring success. And we've hit on one of them, which is sort of the committed or contributor diversity. So having higher diversity and a more active and engaged developer community is I think one of the signs of a more mature model within this industry. The other one we've been talking about a lot, especially in like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, is production deployments. We're giving projects that are actually deployed into production systems. We're kind of looking at them as a higher grade of quality of a project success versus those are sort of like snowflakes in their implementation.
I see.
And then the last thing we're looking at is sort of the community and ecosystem, which we also kind of touched on, right? Which is how diverse is the community and the different offerings that are available based on the community.
So how does that work with these projects deployed in production systems, and what is the, so tell me about the process for that and what comes out of it.
I think in terms of like the measuring of that, it's really more along the lines of if you're getting adoption of your project into production systems, you're getting a little bit more of those issues I mentioned earlier, the happy path, the things like monitoring and scalability and performance are being tested and being improved upon, right? And so you sort of have a little bit of proof that what you're working on has broader applicability and is being used in some systems that you can point to, right? And so I think that's why that measure has been kind of important to the CNCF.
So the happy path leads to the kitchen sink, which leads to a kitchen remodel. but when the kitchen remodel is done, you make sure that the door is not on the ceiling.
Right, exactly.
Okay, good.
And don't forget the trash can, because the trash can is important.
Yeah. And what was the other part? And what was the other part about the community development and the, and ensuring there's, better diversity?
So this is sort of, so what we've been kind of looking at that is you have like, there are some communities that are dominated by a single organization or a commercial ecosystem. And so when you're looking at building on a, kind of building a diverse, if you think about open source being so critical, you don't only want to be open and then having a single organization sort of dominating the community sort of goes against open, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's not like a measure of like good or bad. It's just sort of something to consider when you're looking at how successful an open source project is. Is it sort of being widely adopted across multiple different ecosystems? Is it being used in different verticals of the industry, or is it really a niche solution or a project that's very much dominated by someone in the industry or an organization in the industry that's driving it only for their own benefit? And so it's kind of, a check, you could say, on what's important to your involvement in this community. And are you trying to be part of a larger community, or are you just trying to dominate a single community?
Mm. Let's take a quick break and get back to the show. Join us in Toronto at Cloud Native Day for the Great Galaxy Interplanetary Pancake Breakfast with a pancake robot sponsored by Cisco. We're going to be talking about open source ecosystems, just as we are in this podcast sponsored by Cisco. Learn more about Pancake Breakfast at Cloud Native Day in Toronto at thenewstack.io. Now let's get back to the show. So Nadia, when you're looking at diversity issues inside communities and the hierarchies that we have right now, what are some of the more progressive ways that you're seeing diversity getting instituted? I've talked to some, people who are developers who they say, we're part of kind of a community that's somewhat marginalized in overall society, right? They may be queer, right? Or maybe it's a woman who's a developer in a in a much larger, in a male-dominated open source community and stuff. What are some of the things you're seeing that are working to help bring diversity and to help flatten these hierarchies?
I think a lot of it is sort of intangible. There's been a big move towards including codes of conduct in projects in the past couple of years, which has come not without a lot of controversy,
right.
But I think the broader learning of it is that more people are paying attention to how they talk to each other and treat each other. I think like something that everybody would want to see more of, no matter who you are, is just like more kindness and just politeness in open source projects and the conversations they have. And I think that's like, I like coming at it from that angle because I think it's something that pretty much everyone can agree on, that like being rude to other people is just not productive, period, no matter who you are, where you are, or what you're doing. And it ends up being tied really closely to sustainability, because if you have an environment where people are not nice, consistently not nice, it turns people away. Sometimes those people are already contributing and they stop contributing. Sometimes they just never make a contribution because they look at the discussions and they're like, oh God, I do not want to get involved here. And I've talked to people, I mean, it doesn't even matter what graphic they're in, but like a lot of people have just sort of, said when they first got started, like lots of people were just not nice to them, and some of them chose to stick with it and kind of power through, and a lot of them didn't. So I think like codes of conduct are just sort of like maintaining just more positive collaborative attitude is really helpful. And I think a lot of that gets expressed through your documentation. One thing I'm really passionate about is contributing guides and improving that type of documentation. It goes a long way if on your contributing guide you say like, hey, thank you for your interest in contributing to this project. You are welcome here. Just like something small like that is really helpful. And then also like calling out the different types of contributions that someone can make. I did this whole project where I went through like 40 different open source projects just to read through their documentation and see how they talked about contributions. And some of them only talks about contributions as code. And that was actually quite common. So they make the assumption that a contributor is a developer. And yet when you actually talk to maintainers of projects and ask them where they're most stressed out, it's not about the code. It's almost never about the code. It's about, I have a ton of open issues and I don't have time to triage them. I don't have time to respond to these. It's a lot of like project management stuff. And so I think like explicitly prioritizing other types of contributions or skills, so things like documentation or triaging, are actually really useful to attract a wider audience of contributors, which I think goes hand in hand with a lot of diversity issues. And I think like there are also some diverse issues that are more particular to open source than other places or other types of work, like non-native English speakers face a lot of rudeness, or just like people that aren't developers and have other types of skills to contribute. So
that speaks then to the diversity, not just in terms of the makeup of the individuals in the group, but also the roles and responsibilities.
Totally, yeah. And I think like why a lot of these projects get stuck in these problems is where you have just like one person who's a developer who really like embraces that developer role and doesn't want to think about any other aspect of the project, which kind of goes back to this sort of like, I'm taking care of this for myself, I'm building it for this reason, and they're not looking at the wider picture because there are no other skills or perspectives really represented.
There's a lot of tools that are developing, right, for the automation of open source, ecosystems. And there's not many tools, though, yet for the organization of the communities themselves, are there?
That's a good point. No.
Yeah, I've talked to some people about it. And Ken, you may be able to like count your own experiences from this. So, for example, I think you were there at the Joint conference, the container conference they had in Las Vegas. And the person from Uber was talking about microservices, right? And like with the advent of microservices, it's very easy to start something, right? He recounted how like developers will be standing around, they'll say, yeah, let's create a microservice for that. And then it creates this whole snarl of intercommunication inside the organization. And I know you've been involved in the Mantle project. I'm curious on your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it quite a bit. And, the best way to try to address it is to look at, adding, I hate to kind of call them requirements, but there's sort of like, requirements, maybe you call them user stories, I guess, today, but you definitely want to add some of the monitoring, the integration issues that you're going to run into to the project, right? Kind of going back to what was mentioned earlier, you don't have to necessarily have a project manager on the project, but I think I would suggest that you look at some of the project management attributes that a project needs to have in place, right? And I don't think it takes. Definitely having a project manager is awesome to have, but if you can't get one, if no one wants to contribute in that role on the project, at least take some of the basics around what a project will need to do and sort of standardize around that, right? So you need monitoring, you're going to need to look at security issues and security concerns. You may not have to address all of those in the project, but at least have a set of basic acceptance criteria that you want to meet with the project that helps you identify some of these intercommunication and integration and the different service assurance components that are going to be necessary to really deliver a more complete solution.
Which to me leads to the question of scale, right? We're talking about software that scales, and software that can, work across shared resources, yet the communities often need to scale as well, right?
Right.
But you never know if the community is going to scale or not. It seems like that there's like this paradox there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Is that
and
the
trying to
role?
measure those success criteria around, like, like we look at like stars and we look at, forks. We try to build, like, have meetups and hackathons to try to gauge community interest and understand if people, like, are following what we're doing. I do have some guys managing issues. Like their full-time job is just issue management for issues that come in on Mantle, right? It's just kind of triaging them and prioritizing them. And I'm lucky enough to have a couple of project managers that are full-time on just managing the Mantle project, right? And so I've been able to kind of set it up from that standpoint because I'm a larger organization that can have resources to do this, right? But even if you don't have the resources, I think from my experience, it's not really, these guys are, probably spending, 2 hours of their day, a week doing some of these basic things, right? And so you don't need a whole lot of time or a whole lot of contribution, right, in order to sort of just put some of the basic parameters around the project. I think that's the good news. I'm not trying to downplay the role. I just think we think it's going to be a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of time. And in most cases, it's not too much work and it's not too much effort. And if you put it in up front, that saves you a ton of extra time you don't have to spend later when things go wrong, right? And we have to manage a major issue or a major problem because you didn't put an hour in up front to think about it in a certain way. And you spend, days or weeks trying to fix something you didn't do correctly later, you're going to wish you had spent that hour up front, right? And so it's basic things we've learned in our careers in software development that we've just sort of, I don't know if it's the new generation of developers, it hasn't been trained to think about these sort of systems level issues, or if it's just the lack of, to your point, Alex, a lot of these projects are weekend warrior projects. In the evening when I'm done with my day job, I'll spend a couple hours playing around on my project, right? So most of these things start out as sort of, experiments and turn into something bigger. And I think if we think about it in terms of at what point, maybe a good metric to think about, Alex, is at what point do you go from an experiment to a project that you want to have some maintenance and sustainability around? And I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know if Nadia, some of your research brought out any interesting like ideas around once you get this many contributors or this much, interest in the community. But it'd be good to sort of, I think, over time start thinking about and asking project, maintainers, when are they seeing this line sort of cross from being, this is like my science experiment to, I have a community I'm building here. Because I know, like with Mantle, after about 2 months of going to conferences and talking about it, we crossed that line, right? I couldn't tell you exactly, like it was around 500 likes and maybe like 100 forks, but I don't know if it's necessarily that's a number that we could like stand up behind, or if it's more of you just get this feeling that, okay, this is not going to like go away. This is going to take off. We need to put some rigor around this now before it gets too big that we can't manage it.
Nadia, does that correlate to any of your own research, or was your research not exactly related to that?
It's like totally that. Yeah. I think it's like not having, for a lot of people, just like not having a clear transition point and not even a clear path to understand like, how does my project grow over time? And then what do I need to be doing at those stages? Like, I don't think we even know what those stages are. Like, we don't even, like, it's sometimes a feeling, like kind of saying, like at this point, suddenly you know it's going to be taking off. But it's really hard to put that into words, and it's hard to teach others to say. And I think like my response to that has just been like, okay, how much can you automate and just like take away the decision or the where someone has to like, instead of frame it as like do extra work, like what can you do up front? Like testing has become like really important for this reason of just like, it just makes it so much easier to review and accept contributions and make sure everything doesn't break or whatever. And like having those kinds of frameworks built into your project is really important.
You start, one of the questions I have is, we talk about, the scale of these open source communities and how they develop. It's really quite evident that as technologies become more widely used, like Docker I think is a good example of it, right? You do start to see the development of startup communities come into the ecosystem, and these startups then become in some respects, the stewards of these communities, and they're the ones who almost create the professional models for the management of those communities. Is that a fair assumption?
I mean, I still think some of the biggest projects are not tied to a startup, but I've definitely noticed like more startups taking interest in open source or trying to understand it. I think that sometimes there's sort of like a mismanagement of expectations where a startup thinks of it as free labor, or if I build it, then tons of people will come, or like this is a recruiting tactic. I mean, tons of companies are open sourcing their projects right now, basically as a recruiting tactic. And so I think that's probably just like new behavior. And I think it's ultimately a good thing because it means a lot of people are taking interest in open source I think software is just like totally moving in that direction. So I think all of that is really good. I think there'll be some sort of balance in like understanding and culture over time where those have more realistic expectations of what they can expect out of an open source project.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess just to conclude, I'm curious, we talked about kind of how like there's a fragmentation, there's a need for more understanding of how to share resources. And is this kind of is there a need for more kind of a cooperative approach between the startups or the young company or the individuals who are starting these open source projects, the larger companies who are needing that innovation that can come from those young companies and those individual projects and the customers themselves? Is that happening at all? We're starting to see kind of like these different forces in these ecosystems start to find ways to partner, and perhaps is that best represented in the foundations themselves?
I mean, I'm curious to get Ken's take on it. But I mean, I definitely feel like people are starting to come together, and again, like I think people don't realize just how new a lot of it is. Like open source in the 2000s is different from open source in 2016.
Right.
And so there are just like constantly readjusting norms and behaviors and expectations, and that's okay. And I think that's kind of cool about open source is that it is always changing and evolving. So yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic that there will be some sort of like settling period where people will just understand each other things better.
Yeah, I definitely think that I'm seeing that happening more and more, Alex. I know like in the CNCF meetings, we talk a lot about how do we sort of bring the startup community into the foundation discussions, and how do we bring in companies that are not, I guess there's sort of two ways you can look at what Nadia was saying earlier about the contributions from companies, right? Some of them are trying to just hire talent. And I think it's not that we don't want that sort of input into the effort, but they're not really looking to build the community capabilities out, right? So we're kind of looking for larger companies that actually have a strategy around becoming more open source centric and having contributions and having the right level of support around the community to kind of help kind of bring the startups, the existing companies and these contributors together, right? But I think what I'm starting to see evolve is what I like to call a pattern, right? As we define and get closer to understanding how open source is evolving, and we look at how there are other factors like, moving to more of a DevOps culture, moving to more agile development practices, moving to more of a CI/CD process for actually, deploying multiple times to production a day, right? As all these other factors around the community are happening at the same time, I think we're starting to see a couple of software patterns emerge that will hopefully become sort of like a guidebook for these new projects and these new contributors that are thinking about creating projects, so that they actually get off on the right foundation and the right starting point in the beginning, and not have to wait until the project gets too big for them to really control it and need help, right? And so I'm very hopeful, as Nadia was saying, that I think we're at the beginning of something that's going to be really awesome to be part of over the next several years.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. That's kind of a whole new another conversation too that we should have is about how companies are organized. Really, what is the new organizational structure, for open source software development? Really, I mean, we've talked about this a bit with companies like Capital One who've been very good about changing their platform and changing their mindset really, and being more focused on how do they appeal to the developers, and they went from any number of middleware environments to a handful of APIs, and they just had to do that so they could have an API management lifecycle process that was standardized across the company. But that's not easy to do, right?
Right.
And then that becomes like a question. Then okay, so now we're doing that. What open source communities we have to be to we participate in? That's a whole nother topic that we should definitely talk about another time.
And Alex, just real quickly on that, I think it's important because it ties back to your diversity question. I think, to me, one of the key, there's lots of issues around diversity, but I think one of the core issues I've discovered around diversity is that it kind of goes back to that organization structure and how you're organized in a company for success, right? Because I hope I don't get in trouble, but Cisco, like a lot of companies, has a diversity effort to try to bring in more diversity into our teams, right? And we have soft goals that we want to try to accomplish, right? And it's not about the goals in my mind, so I'm not trying to talk about the goals, but in my conversations with different minorities and different races, Cisco has this there's like a perception about Cisco out there that's difficult to overcome, right? And I think that's why you don't see more diversity, I think, in some of these companies, is that their culture, the way they're organized, the way they approach projects, some of these issues we're talking about here today, until the organization is structured in the right way, it sort of, it kind of causes diversity issues to appear because you're not really the right fit for this community, and that community isn't really wanting to be part of that legacy community that you built, right? And there's sort of I know that's not the only issue, but that seems to be the one I come in contact with quite a bit. So I think you're right. Having a discussion on that at some point would be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Nadia, tell us about your new role at GitHub, just in conclusion.
Yeah, excited about it. So GitHub is really interested in figuring out more formal ways to support maintainers of projects on its platform. I think in my opinion, I think they're sort of like concluding this first chapter of wow, everyone is now using GitHub. GitHub is sort of this de facto way to build open source. It's very closely tied to open source itself. It's just like very embedded in the culture. And then the next chapter is sort of like, okay, given that so many people are on here and using it, how do we actually better support them? And that's goes across, the product itself and different programs that GitHub could be doing to just stay closer to people that use it. And, just like partnerships with other companies, other organizations. So it's lots of different things. And so they're interested not just in, maintainers of independent projects, but also community built open source projects, companies that are trying to get involved. It's just sort of like all this question of like people wanting to better understand how GitHub can be a tool to help them understand open source and to feel supported on the platform. So my role is going to be mostly focused on open source maintainers and designing these programs and partnerships, along with a really great team of people at GitHub to figure out how to make people feel better supported. And special shout out to Brandon Keepers, who hired me into that role and is leading that whole effort. So.
Awesome. So it's a big part of a bigger effort inside GitHub.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And maintainers make sense as a group to really focus on because they're so intimately involved in, using the GitHub platform.
Yeah. And I think they haven't felt as loved as they should have. Earlier this year, there was the whole Dear GitHub thing that had happened, where maintainers wrote this open letter just being like, hey, GitHub, please pay attention to us. So I think I think it's something a lot of people care about right now and that we're going to make a lot of progress on. I'm really excited.
Well, and then the thing that's exciting about that to me, Alex, is some of these issues we talked about, like open, issues management, project management, documentation, like that. Everything I've been implementing at Cisco, we're using GitHub to enforce all of those patterns, right? So if that's something that you're thinking about working on now, you definitely have my support with helping to make GitHub better and easier for sort of some of these integration and open path, happy path issues that we want to solve.
Awesome. We are on the same page.
We're going to title this the Happy Path podcast. Happy Path to the
galaxies beyond.
To the galaxies beyond, through the kitchen door in the ceiling. Well, thank you guys for taking some time to talk and about a topic that I'm interested in quite a bit. I find it endlessly fascinating, and we want to talk to more companies out there too that are trying to find their way in this respect. So if you're listening out there and you're with a company that's trying to find their way in the open source world, please track us down. I can be reached at Alex Williams on Twitter or alex@thenewstack.io. And we'll put, Ken will put your Twitter handle and contact info, and Nadia, if we can put any contact information you feel is pertinent in this podcast, that'd be great too.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Ken, and thanks Cisco for supporting the new Stack Analysts, and we'll be talking about these matters at the Cloud Native Day in Toronto during the ContainerCon, LinuxCon events there. And so we'll be having a breakfast discussion on this very topic, and we have a day of podcasting set up, for the Cloud Native Day there as well. So look forward to that.
Thanks, Alex. Nice to meet you, Nadia.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye. Join us in Toronto at Cloud Native Day for the Great Galaxy Interplanetary Pancake Breakfast with a pancake robot sponsored by Cisco. We're going to be talking about open source ecosystems, just as we are in this podcast sponsored by Cisco. Learn more about Pancake Breakfast at Cloud Native Day in Toronto at thenewstack.io. Thanks again, and I hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.